In the current landscape of US trade policy, the debate has reached an unprecedented level of confusion and misinterpretation. The recent turnaround by a leading Republican figure, one whose support for former President Trump has dramatically waned, has put the spotlight on a fundamental misunderstanding about trade dynamics and economic policy. As policymakers and public figures wage a war of words on trade deficits and tariffs, it is essential to cut through the rhetoric and examine the facts with a clear, analytical lens. At the heart of this debate lies a stark misapprehension of the very nature of trade. Economics teaches us that when two parties agree to exchange goods or services, the deal is inherently beneficial for both. Though it is purchasing a coat for $200 or engaging in international commerce, the underpinning rationale is that both participants find value in the transaction. The notion that every trade must have a definitive loser is a misunderstanding that has been perpetuated by misguided analyses, which claim that trade deficits signal exploitation or economic harm. A trade deficit simply indicates that a country is importing more than it is exporting. This figure is an accounting tool and not an inherent measure of a nation's economic strength or weakness. Consider the simple act of buying groceries. Employers and workers engage in what could be termed a labor deficit, without any negative connotation. The implication here is clear. The counting of deficits in disparate areas, from grocery shops to international trade, is an artificial construct that does not inherently signal a problem. Experts like Rand Paul have consistently pointed out that the true benefit of trade is mutual enhancement, a principle echoed by others who reject the oversimplified notion that a trade deficit is synonymous with being ripped off by a trading partner. Within this framework, President Trump's recent policy initiatives, particularly his unilateral imposition of tariffs, reveal a drastic deviation from economic fundamentals. The argument promoted by his administration posits that such tariffs are a corrective measure against what they view as unfair international trade practices. However, when examined through a rigorous economic lens, the effects of these tariffs are far from beneficial. The new tariffs, implemented without reciprocal negotiations, have introduced hundreds of billions of dollars in additional costs for American consumers and have had an immediate adverse impact on the markets. Following the announcement of the policy, major indexes such as the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq all recorded significant declines, with losses that underscore the real-world consequences of these protectionist measures. The policy framework put forth by Trump also reflects a broader misinterpretation of trade statistics. In a society that thrives on growth, where economic policies such as tax cuts and deregulation have historically spurred, it is natural for the United States to, by artificially isolating trade imbalances and attempting to use them as grounds for broad-based retaliatory measures. The administration is not addressing an intrinsic economic flaw, but rather employing selective accounting to advance a particular political agenda. In this context, the perspective of analysts like Larry Kudlow becomes pertinent, while acknowledging that trade deficits reflect imbalances in import-export activities. They argue that these imbalances are not inherently injurious if viewed against the backdrop of broader economic growth and expansion. A poignant example of the problematic nature of these policies is found in the US trade relationship with Australia. Despite maintaining a trade surplus with the nation, a fact that has been overlooked, the Trump administration proceeded to impose tariffs on Australian goods. This move, which disregards the security and economic importance of Australia as a long-standing partner under an established free trade agreement, further erodes trust. Imposing arbitrary conditions on trade partners, such as demanding that they purchase specific American products or altering the terms of an agreed upon economic relationship, sends a damaging message. It suggests that the United States is willing to renegotiate and even undermine commitments with allies simply to satisfy a rigid or even policy stance. Such strategies not only disrupt established economic ties, but also threaten national security by alienating key partners at a time when strong international alliances are crucial. This unilateral approach to trade policy has precipitated a broader international backlash. Prominent global players, including the European Union and nations like Japan and South Korea, have begun to explore trade agreements independent of the Trump administration's framework. China, for instance, is in the process of negotiating new trade terms with several Asian economies while distancing itself from a US framework increasingly characterized by coercion and unpredictability. When foreign governments see the United States imposing tariffs indiscriminately on both allies and adversaries, trust in American leadership erodes. This erosion is not a mere technicality. It has profound strategic implications. A leader relying on such a heavily biased policy tool risks isolating the nation from invaluable partnerships and ceding ground to rising powers like China. The domestic ramifications are equally concerning. The tariff measures have not only disrupted international trade negotiations, but have also created immediate financial pressures for American industries and consumers alike. Producers who depend on imported inputs face higher operational costs, and the resultant price increases are eventually borne by consumers. The stock market's rapid decline following the announcement of these tariffs is a stark indicator of market apprehension. A fall of over 1,000 points in the Dow, coupled with significant losses in the S&P 500 and Nasdaq, signals deep-seated concerns about the long-term economic impact of such policies. Furthermore, the political fallout from these developments cannot be understated. National polling data, as reported by Navigator Research, reveals that negative coverage of President Trump has surged to its highest point since his ascension to the presidency. This disapproval is driven largely by the disastrous tariff strategy, which many now view as evidence of a fundamental misunderstanding of economic principles. The decline in support is not confined to ideological opponents. Even key figures who once aligned with his policies are beginning to distance themselves. Influential voices such as Rand Paul, Ben Shapiro, Larry Kudlow, and even segments of the political left now converge on the view that the current approach to trade is both misguided and ultimately detrimental to American interests. As the administration continues to aggressively push forward with its trade policies, the underlying message is clear. There is a growing disconnect between political rhetoric and, while Trump's administration has consistently boasted of its purported efforts to project American supremacy, the reality is that such measures are alienating allies and weakening America's negotiating position on the global stage. The insistence on using trade deficits as the primary metric for imposing retaliatory tariffs is not only an oversimplification, it is a strategic error that undermines the credibility of the United States as a fair and reliable trading partner, sir. In conclusion, what we are witnessing is a policy trajectory fraught with contradictions and ill-conceived strategies. The persistent use of tariffs to address perceived trade imbalances without recognizing the fundamentally beneficial nature of free trade creates more economic problems than it solves. As President Trump's policies continue to garner negative reception both domestically and internationally, it is evident that the administration's approach is losing its grip on the real dynamics of global commerce. The mounting disapproval, evidenced by plummeting market indices and adverse polling figures, serves as a stark reminder that there is little merit in the notion of punishing both friend and foe alike. It is a policy not born of strength, but of weakness. A desperate bid to control a complex global economic environment by resorting to archaic methods that are increasingly out of touch with market realities. In light of these findings, the time is ripe for a serious re-evaluation of the principles that guide U.S. trade policy. Rather than clinging to an ideologically rigid interpretation of trade deficits, policymakers must embrace a more nuanced understanding of economic interdependence, one that recognizes trade as a cornerstone of mutual prosperity and global stability. The future of American economic leadership depends on forging partnerships built on fairness, credibility, and the proven benefits of open commerce rather than on arbitrary and counterproductive punitive measures. The growing chorus of domestic critics and the evolving international landscape suggest that the era of unilateral trade battles may soon give way to a more balanced and pragmatic approach that truly serves the long-term interests of the United States and its allies.